were a costume person, or he said you were a costume
Yeah, our
person.
previous lives are both in theater,
Okay.
where we met. So my background is as a set and costume designer, and Jake as a performer and writer and director. And we met with a devised theater company out of New York called The Team that we still work with.
So that explains a lot of the theatrics of your pieces that are so outside of the box that I love. I'm just like, I almost feel like I'm walking into a theater instead of
Yeah, when we first started making, moving into the visual art rubric, we vehemently denied at all times that we had anything to do with theater, that it was remotely related to the theater we were making. It's like absolutely not theater. And now, as we've gone deeper and deeper into it and matured a bit, I think we've sort of come to the conclusion and come to peace with the fact that everything we make, we sort of define as theater now. And it's within visual art spaces often, but we sort of think of it all as theater.
Yeah, it's all focused on narrative. It's all focused on how do you get this emotional charge, this emotional thread through, which is something that's so big in theater and not necessarily always true in the visual arts. But in the visual arts, theater is for the most part a pretty bad word, right? Like you say you're in theater and people are like, oh, you know, or they don't want to like go. They just never, these worlds don't mix, even though they used to. There's this real like, I don't know, thing about it. And so we're just now beginning to, it almost feels like we're like coming out as theater artists in the visual arts context. Or like, trying not to be ashamed of it.
Well, and I think that, I mean, if that's, you know, that's where you both come from, then that's at your core of who you are, so that's going to express itself, whether you are trying to hide it or not, you know, it comes out. But, you know, like, I spent 5 years debating and, you know, being a debate nerd, and so occasionally that comes out, but I'm like, but if you follow this logic, it just comes out. And I love your pieces, though. I have to say, like, the reading does not do them justice at all. They are incredible and totally not what a preconceived notion, and I love them. I love them. They're so much more than what I could have ever imagined myself. So,
thank you.
You want to go to our formal questions? Oh yeah, I told you I was wondering.
And do y'all want us to be looking into the camera or to be conversing with the two of you? Great.
And if you could start by introducing yourselves.
Sure. My name is Jake Margolin.
And I'm Nick Vaughn.
We are interdisciplinary artists based in Houston. We're also a married couple. And our main body of work is a series of 50 installations that are inspired by really old LGBTQIA histories from each state. And so we're making a 50-state project over probably the next 40 years of these large multidisciplinary installations.
The fifth one is premiering in about 3 weeks, and so there's only 45 more.
And the first 4 are here at the OSU Museum of Art, our Wyoming, Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado pieces.
Awesome. Well, then can you tell us a little bit about the project that's currently on exhibition here with us?
Yeah, so when we first started working on what became our Wyoming piece, we had no idea that we were working on a 50-state project. We were just working on a project about how gay identity fit in with Western masculinity and these icons of the cowboy and the fur traders and the mountains. And we found ourselves this one morning on the banks of the North Platte River outside of Casper, Wyoming, in country that we had always thought of as like super hostile to queer people. And we were there armed with this knowledge that in 1843, there had been a trip of about 100 gay guys who had gone from St. Louis up to this remote lake in Wyoming and threw a crazy party for 6 weeks. And we were retracing their trip. And this morning, armed with that knowledge, we had this like total epiphany of like, oh my God, we belong. We belong in this place that we've told we have no history, that we've been told that we weren't part of the narrative of what it is to be an American out here. And it was such a profoundly moving thing. And we found that we looked at the landscape differently, that we thought, well, we got to do one of these for each state. And so since then, we've been off on this wild, quixotic journey to find these histories, learn about them, and make work in each of the 50 states.
And I feel like I should make a quick disclaimer that we frequently make, that we, as artists working with these histories, use a lot of terminology that feels right to us, like this party of 100 gay men. Or we refer to the person at the center of our Colorado piece as someone who would now refer to as a trans man, with the full knowledge that those social identities did not exist at the time that these people were living their lives, and that they would not have identified necessarily in that way themselves, that they were same-sex attracted, but that the various constructions of their identity, and you can get into, like, deep into Foucault and all of this other stuff, but we, as artists, as people who are linking these stories and finding threads to connect these histories with contemporary queer culture, it feels important that we're using the terminology of that contemporary queer culture as we're sort of tracing those threads back.
So after having this epiphany, we decided to move to Texas to work on our Texas piece, and thought that we would be there for maybe 6 months, move on to another place and work on another piece. And as soon as we got there, we realized that we needed to slow our process way down, because part of what we needed to do was not just find out about these histories, but really understand what was going on in the contemporary queer communities in each place. Because it was by understanding what the concerns were amongst people who are living their lives now in these places that we could understand why these histories were resonant. And so there, and then in Oklahoma as part of the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, in Colorado, and then in Arkansas, we've been spending enormous amounts of time over a period of several years learning from community members, talking to experts, doing our own archival research as amateur historians, and then building on groundbreaking academic work that real historians have been doing over the last couple of decades.
So to follow up that point, do you feel like the histories, like the Oklahoma history and everything like that, even Texas, do you feel like the more history you find out, do you feel like it's ever evolving, like these pieces aren't completely finished, but like they're always evolving and changing and you might be adding to them more?
That may be another facet of our background in devised theater, actually. I think we always approach our work as iterative, and we always have the sense that you never really, like, there's no reason to stop changing something. If you find out new information, if you see the way that people are interacting with something, I don't think there's ever, I mean, there are works on paper that we make that are made and then they sit in a frame, and that's kind of a done thing. But in terms of the installations, I think we've always felt that they're a little bit in flux, and that they need to respond to every space, and they need to respond as our position in the world changes and as these stories may evolve a little bit. One of my favorite anecdotes about our theater company is that we've now had, 5 of our plays published, 6 of our plays published, and not one of them represents the most recent public presentation. Like, they're all of the published scripts are now, like, well out of date. So we just keep, I think that spirit to just keep working on something and keep improving and always sort of refining and changing and shifting.
Part of it is also that, the more that we get into it, the more that we know, the more that we then understand about past projects that we were working on, right? And so things that we learn in a new state wind up reflecting on these other things, and we suddenly realize, oh, we had a very shallow understanding of this area, or, geez, there were probably this whole group of people who we should have talked to who we didn't, and then the next time we get the chance to present the piece, we may seek out the funding to go and talk to those people and incorporate them in.
And there's actually one, sometimes that's a very long process, like the Oklahoma piece, which premiered 2 years ago. Is that right? 2 years ago? And we took the opportunity of bringing the piece here to sort of reevaluate what it was and how we were approaching it. And we ended up completely reconfiguring the whole thing. We re-edited the video from ground zero. We reconfigured large parts of the installation and sort of the conceptual structure what was being projected and how it was being projected. And some of it is on a very short time scale. So we did the Colorado piece as a document of a one-night event where we had commissioned all of these gender nonconforming or trans-identified writers and activists and artists to propose toasts to the person at the center of that story. And 2 days after that original event, we got a message from somebody who had attended one of them, who's an intersex activist and writer, that was essentially another toast to call our attention to our sort of the blind spot that we had going into this, to our failure to recognize the possibility that this may actually be an intersex narrative. And so as soon as Kuma had written that, we wrote them back and immediately asked them if we could sort of retroactively commission them to include that toast as well. And so that, within days of having completed the original event, became part of the piece.
So what we see here is not what we will see if you install it again, probably.
Most likely, but I couldn't tell you what will change, right? I don't know yet, but I imagine that after conversations with folks at the opening and after we finish our Arkansas piece and then halfway through researching our Utah piece, we'll suddenly wake up in the morning and be like, oh, this is what we need to do the next time we do that.
Which is not to say you wouldn't recognize them, but
They would be
No,
growing.
it's-
They're ever growing.
They'll grow, they'll evolve.
So you kind of touched on this as to why you chose to continue or do one for each state, but the framework of 50 states, what was the difference in just saying, oh, we'll do one here and there? Why frame it under 50 states? Seeing as how you don't have
So there's part of the underpinning thing of this whole project is trying to assert that queer folk have been a part of what it is to be American since before this was a country, since before European contact, up through European contact, and at every stage, at every point. And the 50-state union is such a fundamental structure to how we understand ourselves as a nation. I mean, I don't know about you, but as we've moved from state to state, and you really, they're really different. And it really is a union of different places, and particularly now that we live in Texas, which really prides itself, right, and as a country, and that's its own complicated story. But that it feels like I don't know how you would tell something that was an American story without at least acknowledging that what it is a federation of 50 very individual places with very individual identities. It's part of it.
yeah, we're also, waiting with bated breath to see what happens in Puerto Rico. Suddenly it has to become a 51-state project. Or who knows, Texas may still secede, so. But that one's already done, so, that doesn't lighten the load at all.
I think from a sort of process standpoint as well, we have found that we need, and I think most artists need, a structure that you can sort of push against and push within. And as you're approaching something as enormous as queer history in America, right, a country of over 300 million people, right, that if you don't have some sort of an organizing principle in there, I think it would be very easy to get lost. It would also become very easy to ignore parts of the country, right? It's very tempting to make incredible pieces about what was going on in the Brooklyn waterfront, in all of these times, or to head to New Orleans and just spend all of our life in New Orleans. But with this structure, when we're saying that our work, we're going to equally weight the work that we do in North Dakota to the work that we do in California, allows us, excuse isn't the right word, gives us the parameters to spend much more time digging and looking where we might otherwise just be like, there's probably nothing, we're never going to find it, or we can't.
But we, I think many people grew up sort of feeling like queer history began and ended in this country in San Francisco and New York. right? Maybe there's a little LA, maybe a little Miami. And then we showed up to Houston and suddenly had this like mind-blowing experience of realizing that Houston had an incredibly huge and incredibly active queer community, and that the 1979 March on Washington probably would not have happened had it not been for Houston stepping in and organizing the whole thing. And it was this like real moment of like recognizing how much even the narrative within queer culture is sort of centered on these two poles of like San Francisco and New York. And part of just that weighting is saying like, there's amazing things happening, or there has been this sort of network throughout the entire fabric. And so that having that list to sort of check off and be like, yep, and North Dakota, yep, and South Dakota, yep, and Rhode Island, and just like, and work your way through and be just sort of underline every single location, every part of this country.
One more reason that we chose a 50-state structure for this is that we love traveling, and we love going everywhere, and we love seeing places that we otherwise wouldn't see. And we often, like, sometimes people will ask us, like, well, what do you do, or like, what do you do outside of your work? And it's just like, this is all we want to be doing. And so setting out, we're going to do this for all 50 states, that means that we've got to go spend a skid of time in Montana, Alabama, and like all of these places that we are so desperate to go and spend time. It's a great excuse.
Okay, so can you talk about some of the challenges of creating the pieces for each state in this exhibition? Like Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and Wyoming?
Yeah, there's challenges at many different levels in creating this work. The biggest challenge that I feel is how coming in as an outsider to a place, and an outsider on many levels, right? Like, we're outsiders in that we're not from any of the places that we're talking about in this show. We're also outsiders in that we are two cisgendered white men or gay men. There's a lot of narratives in here that we're not immediately related to. And a challenge that I have and a fear that I have is that we are perpetuating something that has happened throughout queer history, that's happened throughout American history, which is white dudes from big cities coming in and co-opting histories and saying this is what it was, and making everybody else look through those frames. And it's a constant challenge as we approach things, is to say, how do we make this a platform for people's experiences who are more directly connected to this? And how do we do that without hobbling ourselves, without saying, oh, well, this makes it so that we can't then make work that we believe is vitally important?
I think the other thing that, I don't know if it's a challenge or just a point of awareness, is I think a constant sort of concern to try and thread the needle of political advocacy and propaganda, and keeping the work ambiguous enough that it's truly human and tricky and open and allows people to engage with it on a complex and human way. But also the sort of broader political impulse of the piece to establish a sense of historical agency and presence and ownership over American identity within queer communities. And just always trying to sort of ride that boundary and keep it from tipping too far in one way or the other. And then there's all of the various technical difficulties in doing it. We refer to ourselves as sort of shiny object, in that we get excited about materials, or we try to sort of always work from the point of narrative of like digging out things that feel resonant with that narrative, digging out things that, materials that pop up that sort of are suggested by whatever we're working with. And so it means we're always into new processes and new materials and processes that aren't traditional art making practices or aren't traditional art materials. And so there's always like, at the beginning of every project, there's a steep learning curve. Like, what can we make this do? What can we not make this do? How does graphite behave when you stencil? How deep do you need to stencil it so that the stencil pulls off cleanly? How do you tap the, I mean, there's sort of this like big, there's always a steep learning curve. We had early on when one of the first times we presented a Wyoming piece, we had another artist say something to us about how if we just like worked in wax for a decade, we would get really good at it. And there was just no reasonable response other than like, yeah, we're not going to do that. That's not the way we roll. Like, the thing we are working in for decades that we're getting good at is narrative. Like that is ultimately the material at the core of all of these pieces is narrative. But it does mean that there is always a certain level of like, how are we going to make this work?
And I think that an ongoing challenge with each state has been feeling like we don't have enough time in each one. Getting to the point of our somewhat self-imposed deadlines of premieres and realizing like, oh my God, we could spend the next 10 years just working on making work about Lynn Riggs, just meeting the people who knew him, just meeting, I mean, these are endlessly deep minds that we're just beginning to touch. And so whether it's a difficulty or whether there's a flip side of looking at it and saying the hope is that what we are doing with these is opening a bit of a door that other people are then going to go through and continue to flesh out all of these things.
Okay. In your Oklahoma piece, can you tell us why you featured a day in Santa Fe, and how does your contemporary film fit into that?
Well, I'll definitely say while Nick is figuring out the answer to this, that we knew fairly early on in our process that we wanted to make a piece about Lynn Riggs. Toby Jenkins, who runs the Equality Center in Tulsa, and it was immediately clear that this was a great idea, particularly because we have such a background in theater, right? It was like, oh, this is such a marriage with our own past. And then we spent probably about a year just absolutely floundering about like, what are we going to do? Are we going to remake one of his plays? What are we going to do? And in this wonderful biography of him that we've included a copy of in the education room here, there's a mention of this film that he made in Santa Fe. And we just wondered whether we could get our hands on it, whether we could see it. And we wanted to go to, it's in an archive in New Mexico, and we couldn't make it there. We wound up finding a copy of it and watched it. And I'm not sure why, but something in it rang as like, whoa, this is a glimpse into somebody's way of thinking and mind that feels much more complicated and much more nuanced than anything we were going to do before.
There's like all of these strategies of sort of, there's a lot in his life that is about like displacement and like this kind of weird disconnect between the self that he's presenting and the self that he's living, or the state that he's identifying with and the state that he's living in. And there's something about actually using this film that he made of Santa Fe and deciding to remake the film of Eastern Oklahoma that he couldn't make or didn't feel comfortable making because he wasn't comfortable being here. But he always had a love affair with Oklahoma and always had like a deep respect for the place that like somehow felt spiritually right, that he as an outsider to Santa Fe made this thing that was this love letter to this place, that we were sort of making this thing as outsiders to Eastern Oklahoma, that's sort of a love letter to this place, like through the eyes that we thought he had for it. There's a legendary theater maker who's now deceased called Ruth Malachek, who used to say that like when you do this, there's like nothing interesting happening. You have to do this. And so there's something about like, oh, if we want to talk about Lynn's relationship with Oklahoma, we're actually better served by like looking at what he said about Santa Fe and then going backwards and like trying to deconstruct that and build something on that skeleton. that there's like a sideways glance to the whole process that like actually allows us to get like spiritually closer to what we're interested in than having just done one of his plays at face value, right? Or like just dug into that. There are some of his works that have overtly queer themes. That like that would be a little bit too like, this gay Cherokee playwright did this gay scene, and now we're doing this gay scene of this gay Cherokee playwright. Like, look at it again. That like is great and should be done, but is like not quite, doesn't get at the complexity and ambiguity and sort of like weird, woodgy humanness that I think we're excited about.
I would also imagine that our answer right here, the way that we're answering, is a bit of a glimpse into something which is often true with these pieces, is that we're 4 years into having started working on 50 States, Oklahoma, and we still don't exactly know why this feels like the right way to do it. And we try all these different, it does feel right? It does feel like we captured something about Ben Riggs, and we captured something about queer life in northeastern Oklahoma. But I'm not sure that we've yet landed on exactly the why. I don't think that we think quite that linearly.
Or that
Sometimes.
we will, ever.
Okay. So, what do you have in store next, and what state do you look forward to doing the most?
I want to go to Alaska so bad.
Yeah, Alaska's gonna take a really long time.
Yeah, we're gonna
do
have
this
to-
for years. Hawaii's gonna take forever.
Yeah, that's going to be like a 10-year project that we have to be in residence in.
New Mexico's gonna take a really long time.
The immediately upcoming projects that we have as we're starting work on our Louisiana piece is being commissioned by a wonderful organization called Diverse Works in Houston. And then we're beginning work on our Utah piece. We've got some inklings of what our Maryland piece is.
I think we said this at the beginning, but the Arkansas piece is going up in 3 weeks.
And with both, with Louisiana and with Utah, which are the next two that are really coming up, we're in a now familiar place where we can tell you exactly what we're working on, and we're pretty sure that as soon as we actually start spending time there, the whole thing's going to shift, right? And it's going to turn 180 degrees to something else. But right now, we're focusing in Louisiana on the shipping industry in Louisiana up the Mississippi, and we're going back about 300 years to like a number of different narratives that are instances of queer life intersecting with the shipping industry.
And in Utah, we're starting to look into an anthropologist who spent his life sort of chronicling the queer subcultures in the hobo community and the sort of train hoppers.
A bunch of his work was done in Ogden, Utah in the 1920s. One other thing I would say that's happening is that we've really turned our focus in the last year to presenting our work in queer community spaces as well as in art spaces. And so this last year, we brought an installation that we made to the Tahlequah, Oklahoma Pride Festival, which is a small pride, grassroots pride festival.
We brought another piece into a university library in collaboration with their special collections. We've brought some works on paper for a couple-month installation at a gay bar in Houston.
We did a performative lecture in collaboration with a drag queen in Houston as a fundraising event for a queer archive. And on the one hand, you know, we often talk about amongst ourselves about like trying to identify like what dragon are we chasing, right? Like what are we trying to do with our life work here? And it has felt in those moments of like bringing the thing to Tahlequah's Pride, in doing it as a fundraiser in a queer bar, that like suddenly all the pistons are firing, and it's exactly what we want the work to be for, exactly who we want it to be for. So I think that coming up, there's going to be a lot more of that.
So can you just tell us like a little bit of your time doing the Tulsa Fellowship Artists residency?
Definitely. So the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, which is a George Kaiser Family Foundation project, is this spectacularly visionary idea of what happens if you just give artists a bunch of money and space and let them do their thing in Tulsa. And it was an absolutely perfect alignment with what we were up to. It was everything that we needed on that front.
It's our home base for a year while we basically figured out what the Oklahoma piece was, and then it's where we used to, as the sort of basis for shooting all of it. We brought in a filmmaker friend from New York to help us shoot it. It was great. It was a good year.
And the other artists who they brought in wound up being really close colleagues and people that we would bounce ideas off of. And they got to see our work developing over a long period of time and would give us really insightful feedback. And in a way that doesn't often happen because you're not often in that close proximity with people for that long. It was for us a confirmation of what we had come to suspect after living in Houston for a year, which is that there was no way to make this work without actually living in the place that we were talking about
Or at
for
least
an
spending
extended amount of
significant
time.
amounts of time there.
That there's just aside from all of the sort of smaller nuances of just like a way a place works and a way that people in a place interact with each other, there were the logistics of like the number of times that people would just be like, oh, well, you know who you should meet, but they're sick right now, or they're out of town and they're not going to be back for 3 weeks, or this event that you should totally see is in 3 months, you know, or any chance you're coming back through, that only works if you're there. And when people say like, hey, you should show up on Saturday night to this thing, and then that's where you meet the person who becomes your collaborator. That's when you meet the person who like has that insight into the thing that makes everything click for us poetically. And we've continued to be involved in the Tulsa Artist Fellowship.
They help support the 5-channel piece that we made after the Oklahoma piece with a bunch of the same collaborators called Political Gestures that we did. That was commissioned by an experimental film center in Houston called Aurora Picture Show, and we did in collaboration with Oklahoma Contemporary.
And they also are how we met this
It's
museum. Was through
Studio
we had our
visit.
studio visit with Vicki, and it was through that these conversations started, and that was now 3 years ago, and it turned into this show that we're so excited about.
So you've said that you feel that these pieces are in part advocacy. Do you see them as an unusual form of activism?
It depends on the day that you ask. I mean, I think like anybody I don't know anybody. I think many people in the arts feel on any given time, and particularly in this political moment, there are days where it's like, oh, we should chuck all of this and go into election law. We're not doing anything. And the world is going to shit. And then there are other moments where like you have interactions with somebody, with a person who grew up queer in a small town. You know, when we first presented the Wyoming piece in Houston, there was a family friend coming through who had grown up just outside of Casper. She's lesbian. And watching her reaction, seeing this piece, and like processing what it meant to her and what it meant internally, and like just how that like the ramifications that had in her psyche, and how massive that was, felt like, oh no, actually this is the most important thing we can be doing. And it's small, and it's particular, and it's exceedingly targeted, if not well aimed. But that those small moments of interaction actually feel deeply profound and feel like they motivate a certain level of quiet political shift. And then I do think there's also like a certain level of soft propaganda in the whole thing, of like letting people who are not necessarily inclined to look kindly on the queer community to sort of look at these slower, not necessarily confrontational stories and open a little pocket of understanding or empathy. Because they're not, the pieces in here, and the pieces like broadly in the 50 State Project, not that we don't make other work that isn't, but none of the work here is like particularly aggressive politically. We're trying not to hit anyone over the head with like a dogmatic command to feel a certain way or have a certain view. We take to the streets with posters for that.
We try to excavate for ourselves how our talents as artists can be useful in the political realm, and there are artists who are so talented at making agitprop work, and we're just not that talented at that. What we're really talented at, I think, is getting at the complexities of these things and how like deeply human they are. And I think in the like long game, I hope that that's an important part of political progress. I think that the agitprop part is vital. I think that folks like Grand Fury and the work that they did during ACT UP, right? Like it's the most spectacularly important art in the queer community. And so I'm in no way meaning to undermine that. But I hope that this is something that supports it on another level over a really long time frame.
And then, because I come from this aspect of it, how does your research inform your work as to like go through that, where you research what is that you do to decide this is where we're going, this is what we're digging at, you know, instead of following that rabbit hole. And then how does that become these beautiful pieces?
In some way, I think the bridge between research and work is largely instinctual. Like it's about digging around until you kind of strike the thing that suddenly like in your brain explodes into 14 other things that like attaches to culture and economics and like all of these other things that suddenly explode out of like, oh, this story holds so much more than itself. You know, that there's like a multiplicity of like thematic stuff in this like little nugget of story. And I think when those hit, it's just a sort of feeling thing of like knowing that that's the one that like attaches to all of these other places. And then we'll find like there are other threads that often get looped in and tied in. And with each installation, we also develop a performance lecture that sort of goes along with it. And so those hold a lot of that other information that like we may have come across but doesn't find its way into a finished piece. But I also think a lot of that other stuff floats around in the culture of it, and there's almost like there's like internal logics in pieces, right? There's all kinds of internal logic in the Oklahoma film that I don't think is explicit, and I think ultimately if you start trying to explain it all, confuses the piece and confuses the feel of it and isn't necessarily helpful, but internally structures the thing and gives it a certain kind of spine and order.
There's two basic kinds of research that we have generally done at the outset. And I should say that each state has gone very differently. And we've gone down different rabbit holes. But there's been archival and library work which has generally meant figuring out in each place who's got the really cool collection that is relevant to what we're doing, and then just holding up there and reading as much as we can, and letting that tangentially lead to this thing and that thing. And like, oh, you read this article on microform that suddenly makes you realize, oh, you should really know about this whole realm, and just trying to familiarize ourselves. And the other is this much more informal hanging out with people and taking people out for lunch and saying, you know, this is what we're up to. What do we need to know? And then they'll tell us what we need to know. They'll tell us who we need to know. They'll tell us what we need to be there for. And it's been pretty different which one of those things has then led to that spark that Nick was talking about, where suddenly we'll look at each other and be like, oh, yeah, that's it, let's go. And then things start to fall quickly into line. But for instance, our Colorado piece involved, you know, like pretty standard archival, like digging through county record rooms in Los Animas County, Colorado, going through like these leather-bound books that I cannot believe they were letting us touch, but they were just like, yeah, whatever, go back there. And, you know, like going
Writing to
through
courthouses in Hannibal, Missouri for marriage records. I mean, just like, you know, old school historical dig.
And then how it turns into these installations is also different each time, but there are some methodologies that we sort of consistently and often at this point almost subconsciously use. And we're going to be giving 2 workshops in March that are about how we approach turning historical material into artwork, and sometimes what we like to think of as like how to make art that means something, that's about something. And so very briefly, a couple of those strategies that we use are, one, incessant list making in our minds, and this is from our theater days, of looking at a narrative and then just as an exercise going, what are 25 things that could happen in a piece about this? And from those, maybe nothing comes, or maybe we come up with a material, or maybe we come up with a form or something, or maybe we come to a dead end and go, nothing all that interesting can happen about this. Let's go on to something else.
I'm gonna ask. So, sorry, I'm going off script. So, what is that piece of research that you were never able to find that you feel like you know is out there and you really want it? You just got to find that right person.
I think there's an entire body of work of the like pieces that we know are out there or were out there at some point and are gone.
Our Arkansas piece actually sort of revolves around not being able to find a paper trail. It deals with a same-sex partnership in the late 20s. And there's numerous references to the relationship. There's letters from one historian to another laying out the case of the fact that this may have been a relationship, and I'm looking into this. Do you have any more information on it? There's a couple one-sentence references in books to the relationship, and there is zero paper trail. And for a long time, we sort of struggled with the fact that the story felt so right, but we couldn't track it. Like, we couldn't back it up, and it's the first of the states that we haven't been able to like really lay out on paper and like, this clearly happened. And I think ultimately we've landed in a place of recognizing that so much of this history has been obliterated and destroyed by concerned family members who burned journals and records and letters, by people who are covering their own tracks. That ultimately that piece is largely about the murkiness of that history, which doesn't mean we don't still want to find some kind of like concrete thing between the two of them, some love letter like tucked away in the back of a book somewhere. But also at peace with the fact that we probably never will.
I would say one specific document that I would love to be able to see is that our Colorado piece revolves around
We
a
may still get our hands on this one.
named Charles Frenchy Vospa. And there's a number of documents around this one that we would love to get our hands on. I'm curious which one Nick is thinking of. For me, I would love to find a photograph of his wife. He moved to Trinidad with a wife, and there was a kid that either she had before they got together or she had when they were together. And we were able to figure out her name. We were able to figure out where they lived, the house they bought together. We were able to find their marriage license. They were legally married in Hannibal, Missouri. But there's no photograph of her, and I know that there is out there. Everybody was getting photographed of, it's
Yes.
somewhere.
See, I thought you were going, there's the Sisters of Charity who ran the hospital that he finished his life in. That sounds like he killed himself. That he spent the last 2 years of his life in. Many of them kept journals, and we know that those journals exist, and we know that they are somewhere in the stores at the head of
The Mother House.
at the mother house of the Sisters of Charity, and we've written to them a couple of times, and it's never panned out. But
They've assured us that there's nothing of interest to us in the journals, which
I don't
of course there
quite buy it. So we're still holding out hope that we can work our way into those journals at some point. It would be amazing to see what the sisters who ran the place were writing about during those couple of weeks when he first showed up.
I would be curious just to know what they were writing about, period.
Yeah.
That too.
Yeah.
So fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you all
Thanks.
so much for doing
Thank
this.
you.
I
Thank you.
could talk to you all afternoon.
Yeah, seriously.
I realized we probably should have asked you at the beginning what the goal in terms of duration on this was, because as we are prone to do, we will talk forever. But we can, if you ever need us to talk succinctly, we can do that.
Okay, that's not as fun, but yeah.